single one of my co-authors on every one of those papers is a woman. So that's what I meant when I said feminism is as feminism does, because actually as I reflected on that, it actually hadn't really occurred to me that essentially I completely surrounded myself with women. And the fact that it hadn't occurred to me, I think, is significant. Because what it says is, I didn't pick any of those people. Clearly they didn't pick my daughters to be daughters, but I didn't pick any of those people because they were women. I picked them because they were the most qualified, the most intelligent people, and the people who were most aligned with the things that I cared about and that I wanted to study and that I wanted to discuss. And the fact that they were women was just incidental to me until I realized, you know, women in fact have an incredibly powerful influence on my life, far more as it turns out than men do. And in some regards, I think a recognition of that fact is ultimately kind of our goal as we pursue feminist agenda, as we pursue a feminist understanding and a feminist perspective. That in fact there should be no such distinctions. In fact that we should in fact be able to look at each other not in terms of whether or not we are men and women, but rather whether or not we trust each other, whether we understand each other, whether we recognize each other's perspectives, whether we respect the contributions that each of us can make to a conversation. So, at least from my perspective, the thing that I think that I could contribute and that I hope to carry across in my opening remarks really is that feminism is as feminism does. And my commitment, in fact, that I too will join in that chorus of voices to condemn those who in fact would attempt to relegate women to a secondary role, or would in fact belittle them on the basis of their choices to in fact assert their own rights. And I think that this comes at a particularly important time in that conversation. So I applaud the Women's Resource Center for organizing this event. I am grateful for the opportunity to speak in front of you, grateful to my colleagues for voicing their opinions here, and grateful for organizing this. So thank you very much. I'm looking forward to it.
I'll add to that briefly from a student perspective. We've had a lot of pushback within the Women's Resource Center in my last 4 years here at Rice. We have a lot of difficulty getting women to come to events, to participate in discussions, and we've even had some pushback and suggestions that we should rename the Women's Resource Center the Gender Resource Center, which I think has its pros and cons, but I think the broader issue is that we don't live in a post-feminist society or a post-gender discrimination society, and I think that's something that we really need to work towards discussing as young people on this campus. So I'm really excited to hear the perspectives that these experienced, seasoned men have to share with all of you to get that conversation started. So I guess to start, if you could all go down the line, introduce yourself, your association with Rice, and maybe some sort of aspect of how you're involved with feminism, some sort of project or opinion or identity that you have in regard to that. Brandon?
I guess I'll start. Hi everyone, my name is Brandon Mack. I'm a very proud Rice alum. I graduated in 2006, Weiss College. Shout out to anyone from Weiss. Currently, by day, I work in the admission office as an assistant director of admission, who works specifically with minority recruitment. At night, I do a lot of different things, including I'm a grad student currently working on a master's in education, but before I got my master's in sociology. And the focus of my project was on ephimophobia, which is the fear of effeminacy in gay men towards other gay men. So it deals with race, gender, sexual orientation, how those all kind of mix and mingle with one another, and how that plays out in terms of how men self-identify with respect to their sexual orientation, and then also how does that interact with how they interact with one another. So in terms of how I feel with respect to femininity, is that especially with respect to this particular project, you see all those things. You see how men feel about effeminacy, what they do with respect to effeminacy, and how they interact with each other on that basis. And it speaks a lot to how, in turn, we interact with our fellow females, how we view women, and so therefore it speaks a lot to that. So I'm interested to talk to you guys about all this.
I'm Joe Adams. I'm in the graduate program in philosophy. And I'm also enrolled in a graduate certificate in the study of women, gender, and sexuality, and the center we have over there. And one project I'm working on right now is where the philosophy department has been a historically underrepresented discipline in terms of gender distributions. And so we are beginning to look at that, study that. We're having a conference on Friday. So that's presentation.
Good evening. My name is Riedel. I'm also a graduate of Rice University from the anthropology department, where I got my doctorate in 2005. And after a stint working in nonprofit here in Houston, Rice offered me a position back here, so I hired myself back home, where I have stayed ever since, at the Center for the Study of Women, Gender, and Sexuality, where I am now the assistant director, and I also teach the introduction to LGBT studies.
My name is Ben. I'm a first-year environmental engineering PhD student. Mostly all I've done so far is keep the Women's Center open at some random hours. But I'm also somewhat of a policy wonk, if you know what that means. I follow a lot of policy issues and looking forward to getting more involved as my time here goes on and I get settled.
My name is José Aranda. I'm the chair of Hispanic Studies. I also have an appointment in the English department, and I'm a former master at Baker College. And when we were masters, Krista and I, Dr. Comer and I, what we did dramatically, I think, was to promote female leadership within the college, not to the exclusion or demotion of men, but that was kind of our thing. We did that, and Krista started Girl Talk, and eventually the guys wanted me to start Boy Talk. And that's how those two things started on campus. So I still promote female leadership, but it's a little less dramatic since I'm not in the college, and I do it as a chair and as a colleague to women faculty in Hispanic Studies, French Studies, and English.
Maybe we'll start with, what does feminism mean to you, and when did you begin to understand and associate with feminism or pro-feminism, if that's the case? Anyone want to start?
I'll start. I'll give it a shot. You got to know, I think everybody has a story. Women have a story, men have a story around ideas like feminism or any ism. And for me, I have to be really straightforward with you. When I was born and raised here in Houston, and I graduated in 1980, so that's a long time ago. And things looked really different back then. But I left town to go to Yale. And I thought I was going to get a kind of cerebral intellectual education, which I did. What I didn't know, and what has been more long-lasting, is this social education. And so it began right from the beginning. And I have to tell you that one of the strongest impressions I have about being an undergraduate at Yale is like realizing that I knew nothing about women, really. And I didn't know anything about racism, really. And I didn't know anything about homophobia, really. And it was there between being 18 and to 22 that I really got to understand these things up close and personal. And around feminism, it was all my buddies, all my buds, all the women friends I had. They were the ones who were educating me, not directly, but just by their actions. And then slowly but surely, I was understanding certain terms, and professors were teaching certain things, and it was drastically different than growing up in Texas, let me tell you. All that. So that's how it started for me.
Thanks, José.
I'm actually also an graduate of Yale undergraduate college as well, so I'm happy to hear you had a good time there as well. For me, feminism just means treating women like people who have all the same rights as men, but it often, and over time has come to mean a little bit more than that, which means not just personally treating women with respect they deserve, but also advocating that other people do the same.
It's really interesting that you use the word advocate, because that's Bell Hooks' formulation, right? No one is a feminist. We're supposed to advocate feminism, because it's not some perspective that one set of people owns. It's a philosophy that many people contribute to. And I think part of what catalyzed me to get there was the realization that it wasn't just the single lives of the people that I knew. You know, how my mom got passed over for promotions again and again in a bank, a highly male-dominated world, particularly in finance portions of the bank. but also how many of the women in my lives, their lives were structured in ways that were in parallel with each other. So it became a larger problem, right? And I think it was that catalyzing moment of college, actually, where I saw it also happen to graduate student friends of mine. The way they were treated was different based on their gender. So that changes things. And I think when you start to see a pattern, you're like, oh yeah, that's a problem.
Being a philosopher, I'm always want for some kind of definition. So feminism to me means a belief that sex oppression exists, and then a commitment to rooting it out. I first got exposed when I took a philosophy class, philosophical issues relating to women. So sort of feminist philosophy. That was not at Rice, but I got a master's working at Rice over at Georgia State. And it spoke to me. I heard things that I hadn't heard before. And what then hooked me was that class. There were sort of a number of awakenings, coming into awareness that subsequently seemed so obvious, but I was so blind to before. One of them is more impersonal, and one is about myself. And the impersonal one is one of the articles where I talk about the career trajectories, and the fact that in corporate America, in academia, the 20s and 30s are the time when you have to really work. But that's set up for a man's biology, right? And I thought, oh, of course it is. But it just wasn't a part of my field of awareness. And then the other thing was when I realized with horror that the way I treated female professors was different than the way I treated male professors. And so I just realized that it wasn't overt, right? I was more likely to object to a female. In philosophy, we do a lot of objecting and responding, argumentation, discussion type things. So I was more likely to object, and then also more likely to object at length. Whereas if it was a male professor, I was sort of more reserved, and I would make sure my point was really good, and if he had a rejoinder, I would back off. So that was a moment of sort of personal, wow. And there's no difference in quality among these professors.
For me, I identify with feminism because of the fact that for me it's once again about oppression and power dynamics, and the fact that, innately as being a woman, you're automatically given a lower power position because of the fact that our society kind of ranks us in terms of when it comes to our power positions, where it's like the highest level is to be a white heterosexual male. The bottom position could be, any number of a combination of things. It could be a black, lesbian, female, being these type of things. And for me, being a double minority, being an SGL, African American man, I already have experienced the racism. I've already experienced the homophobia. So for me, I've already experienced a lot of these discriminations. What does it look like me as a discriminated person, discriminating against someone else who's already discriminated for just being who they are? So I automatically, kind of innately identify with feminism in the fact that I don't like the discrimination that I face, therefore I need to also speak against discriminations that other people face just for innately being who they are.
And I think that's something I try to articulate with men is that feminism can't have inclusive goals while having an exclusive membership, right? Like we need everyone in this discussion. It's like we'll never achieve racial equality if we have white people walking around saying racism doesn't affect me. It doesn't matter to me, it's not in my life. So maybe my next question would be, how do you articulate that to people, men and women, that gender equality affects us all, and this is an inclusive battle that we need people to be actively engaged in and advocating in? What sort of words and like vocabulary would you use to drive that point home?
If for some reason I found myself trying to explain this to somebody who didn't seem to agree on a purely humanitarian basis that this was the right thing to do, I would say I haven't met anybody so selfish they would never care for their own hypothetical children. And I would say, well, you're probably going to have daughters someday if you don't already. What sort of world do you want them to live in? What sort of world what sort of opportunities do you want them to have? How do you want them to be treated? And if the answer is I want them to be subjugated, then I really can't have a discussion with them anymore. The answer is, well, I want them to live in a world where they have good opportunities, they can get an education, they're respected by society as a whole. Well, then I say, congratulations, we're on the same side. Now let's discuss how we can do that.
How would you confront open contempt for a woman, like Rush Limbaugh's in the room? He calls her not a slut, like what would?
I think it depends a lot on what my relationship is with the person making the comments and in what scenario. So to confront Rush Limbaugh, he's been, I don't want to be too partisan, but there are some people in society who have been spewing misogyny for a very long time, and Rush Limbaugh, I think, is one of those people. So to convince him to stop is very difficult. The current campaign has sort of hit a critical tipping point where his advertisers are leaving. That's one way to hold accountable a public figure. You send a letter to them, you send a letter to the people who fund them, however that's going on. I would take, obviously, a very different tactic if somebody who was an acquaintance of mine, or heaven forbid, a friend, started making sexist comments, started cracking rape jokes, did something like that. And the difference there is to stop, you can be personal about it. You can say, not only is that not a good thing to do in the abstract, I'm not going to tolerate that. This is one instance in which your intolerance is intolerable. And point it out. It's quite likely that they're not aware that what they're doing is offensive, that, because most people don't go around doing things that are evil and thinking, yeah, this is evil, it's great. They have rationalizations, and so you try to help point it out exactly how that works.
So I think one of the underanalyzed and certainly underconversed aspects about feminism is that it's always conceded that sexism affects women, victimizes women, hurts women. So the underconversed aspect is how sexism affects men. And although most men would, if you ask them directly how has sexism affected your life, they will probably answer you within a few minutes. And so there's just any number of ways that sexism has erroneously placed men in certain positions as either a stereotype or as a gender. So I wrote a few things so I wouldn't forget. So under the category, how has feminism changed my life? So I'll just read a few things. So I, as a man, do not have all the answers. And I think people who practice sexism unknowingly actually are burdened by this. They think they have all the answers. They've been told and conditioned, everybody should listen to you because you have all the answers. So the truth is, men are really burdened by this idea. We do not have all the answers. And if people stop thinking that we had all the answers, we might figure it out that somebody else might.
Would you mind if I ask the audience a question quickly? How many people have heard of mansplaining? Mansplaining. Mansplaining. Okay, we got a couple.
For those of us who haven't heard, because I only saw 2 hands.
It was mostly for my own curiosity. I didn't mean to derail you through a list that started off very well. But like any group of people, feminist circles have somewhat of their own jargon, and that phenomenon that he was describing is often called mansplaining. It's a man essentially talking usually to a woman as if he knows everything, and it's especially atrocious when, of course, he may be talking to an expert. Whether he assumes they're not an expert or is just such a dick that that he goes on anyway, even knowing that he's talking to an expert, that's the phenomenon that he's talking about.
so working against sexism may have liberatory effects for men. So I, as a man, can be quiet and listen to people who happen to be women. That can be a very liberatory position for a man. And the third one, and then I'll stop. I, as a man, am perfectly capable of being led by a woman or women. That too can be very liberatory for a man.
Thank you, yeah.
I like asking people who they admire, just to listen to the list they give to themselves when they start saying who they admire. And if they start after a while, just passively not mentioning women, they've told themselves what they're doing. And you don't have to be like, it comes to them. But if they start listening to the people that they admire, they're like, oh, wait a minute, how did that happen? The best mentors in my life have happened to be women. Right? So sharing that, I think, helps people.
I really like the suggestion by José of sort of you want to meet. On the overt, I don't. Of the strong sort that you mentioned with the question about, I have great fear. I would be in so much fear. I wouldn't know what to do. I'm sort of thinking about. So people are coming to me about this conference, and it's sort of it's easy to convince people that if there's a wrong, then they should fix it. But then a lot of what I confront is helping people to see that there's a wrong going on. And so somehow getting drawing on something that's in their turf and drawing a connection between that and what I'm seeing is a way to do it. Brian sort of mentioned this kind of approach, and I struggle with that. I don't know when, it seems to me sometimes firmness and directness and some kind of the firmness and directness is sometimes appropriate, sometimes justified and needed. But then there's this puzzle about when is that going to be counterproductive.
And it's perceived as strife.
Right. And then am I reinforcing stereotypes? And then I think it's messed up that I have to have this worry, right? But for the sucks, so when firmness and directness isn't the right way, this kind of figuring out what their turf is and drawing connection to this issue.
Yeah, I think on the kind of micro level, so the everyday kind of individual who you seek to participate with this, the personal approach is definitely the best way to kind of talk to them, kind of see what experiences they've encountered, because I think a lot of times some people come to their experiences with respect to if they're practicing, anti-feminism, anti-homophobia. It is rooted in some experience or even a lack of awareness of other people in diversity. So I think that sometimes just trying to engage and figure out where they're at definitely helps them to hopefully look at things in a different perspective. Now, with respect to Rush Limbaugh, I would hope that I would approach it with quiet, dignified, deconstructive constraint. But unfortunately, I do not think that would ever work.
Brian's comment reminded me of a friend of mine who, if she starts dating a guy, she'll friend him on Facebook, and she'll look at his favorite books, his favorite music, and his favorite movies, and if there are several lead female characters, several female authors, it's done. I wouldn't necessarily take it that far, but I think it's interesting to reflect maybe on your own kind of like top 10 list of favorite books, favorite movies, you know, pop in a mixed CD, how many artists are female, and does that reflect a systemic issue of exposure and of models of success, or does that reflect your personal taste, and how much is your personal taste influenced by these systemic issues? And I think that's a really interesting kind of easy way to personalize it to people you're talking to. And Jose, you reminded me of this question of, so if gender equality benefits everyone, how does this sort of fear of the feminine help us to more courageously and deeply reflect on what masculinity is? And I'm sure you have a lot, Brandon, to add to this. And if, effectively, at the root of it, the fear of feminism is the fear of the effeminate. How does that help us think more about different models of what the masculine is or could be, or what a man is in today's society?
Well, things have changed a lot as far as that goes. So there's that whole subgenre of writing and movies. What do they call it? Romances. Romances.
I like that word.
Yeah, I know. That kind of thing would have been totally unheard of in the 80s and much of the 90s. Although, when you look at cop movies in the 90s, the Mel Gibson, what's the other African American actor? Geller. Yeah, you begin to see the roots of why that kind of narrative is now here. But that's all in relationship. I think it's all in relationship to how students in college, for the most part, have changed. It used to be when I was in college in the early 80s that the only way you can really tolerate, people can tolerate having a lot of, if you're a guy, having a lot of women friends, was if you were somehow always chasing one of them for some ulterior thing, or you were already had a girlfriend or something like that. But nowadays, especially when I was in the master, I was really amazed at the fluidity with which men and women have relationships these days. They vary so much, and they move so much, and there are rules to it. You can see that there are rules to it, but they're totally different from when I was a teenager and young adult. And so so I guess what I'm trying to say is ideas and concepts of feminism or masculinity, they're not static. They are always changing, and there's a give and take, and there's not just one way of looking for the causes of it. It's very dynamic, and so men's current masculinity have really evolved a lot in relationship to, I think, youth culture. That's what Krista would say. Krista would say that youth culture is really a driving force behind a lot of the changes. And if you talk to boomers, older boomers, Gen Xers, they have very defined ideas about gender relationships. Gen Y and millennials, they're different.
I guess what I would add to that is, at least what I've seen in my work on femophobia, a lot of what they attribute masculinity and femininity to is once again to power and privilege. So it's like the masculine has privilege. To be a masculine gay male is to be a prized individual within the community. It is to be non-clockable. You can still be a man. No one ever questions your masculinity, nor do they question your sexuality. They don't know because they're not easily able to tell. But to be feminine, you're now able to be discriminated against. You're able to be called out. You lose the privilege that is associated with male privilege. So to me, that kind of redefines, okay, this is how we're thinking about femininity, feminism, all these things, is that it is now you are associated with women. You have gone to that lower level in terms of the whole power dynamic. So I think that's what that I think is really, I still see it with respect to how we engage, is that people want to be here, but still men, because of male privilege, automatically have this kind of dynamic.
No, I think that's an important point, and I was discussing this panel with a gay friend of mine before I came here, and he was like, well, just keep in mind that misogyny, it hurts effeminate men, and it hurts it doesn't just hurt women. And I thought that was like something that I hadn't particularly thought about at length, and it's definitely a good point, so I'm glad you're here to comment on that. I don't know if we want to jump this deep already, but one of our panelists proposed this question, and I think it's really interesting. How can men see pornography today through a feminist lens? And I think the third wave feminist community is still, it's fairly cohesive in a sort of a pro-sex approach, whereas if you talk to second wavers, there's still lots of anti-pornography feminist rhetoric. You don't see that as much in our generation, but I thought it was an interesting question of how can you reconcile with this industry that oftentimes is very misogynist or racist in its tropes. If you want to go there.
I'll dive in.
Yes, Ryan.
I'll also plead to be the guilty party property.
I wasn't gonna.
I'll out myself on that. Part of what I see is a really radical transformation about how pornography is created in the 21st century. It's not always created by somebody else for our own consumption. We are often creating our own pornography for our own consumption. And there are some commentators who have seen this as just the replication of another form of oppression, but in this case it's self-oppression, by fitting ourselves into somebody else's narratives type, right? Robert Jenkins at UT Austin is a proponent of this particular perspective. But what's really interesting is when you talk to pornographers about what they do, they often have it from a sense of liberating a particular community from the stories that other people have been telling about themselves. And I find that to be a really feminist-inspired perspective. And I think there's so much that we have attached to the sexual as negative that we forget that pornography is a large category that contains everything from erotic stories to the kinds of things that Jesse Helms and the NEA4 were fighting over, Robert Mapplethorpe, etc. Right? Pornography is not just pictures. It's stories about the way that we imagine ourselves as sexual beings. So much of that has to do with power. And so those are kind of the motivations behind that question. And I think that exactly what Brandon is getting at, that male privilege often acts from presumption instead of the gift of power being given to you by somebody else, right? True privilege is given to you by other people because they respect you and because they have value for you. Privilege that is taken and presumed, I think, is the kind of power that many people see as the rough and tumble masculine, what was it?
Mansplaining.
Yeah. So I see pornography as one version of that. And I'm concerned when people want to dismiss all forms of sexual storytelling as inherently exploitative. So I think that undermines what we're doing when we tell stories about ourselves as sexual beings. But I've gotten on soapbox.
So I'll agree to that and take a slightly different stand. I'll agree to what Brian is saying. I think going back to what Brandon was talking about, keeping in the analysis of power exploitation in front of us, the problem with pornography isn't the eroticism, So everybody knows, for example, that when they uncovered the structures of Pompeii, they found pornography graffiti. So it's an old ancient habit of ours as human beings to get off on portrayals of sexual activity. So that's not going to go away. The issue of pornography is precisely when it ventures into the public sphere and people are actually getting hurt by it. So a couple of weeks ago we had a speaker about the sex trade in Houston and how Houston is the capital for that. And so there's some kind of broad gradation between people's sexual addictions, pornography, and human trafficking. They're not, where one begins and ends, no one can say. It's just that as consumers, as these kind of sophisticated consumers that we are, we have to be very aware of these things, that our small gesture here may be part of some larger mechanism. That's one thing to say. When I was a master baker and I was educated to the fact that people in college thought it was really cool to get together and watch porn a lot. Men and women, I was like, whoa, I can never do that. That would never be me. It's like, I don't want to talk about that. I don't, I was like, well, that's just so different. So it made me feel really old. Older anyway. Or feel as they used to say in the late 60s, early 70s, my hang-ups. I do have those hang-ups. It's not an easy conversation to get into. Also, I'm in a power position, talking about power again as a master. You can't be talking about in a friendly way, oh, pornography, tell me more about it. That is not your job. Your job here is to have an environment for free exchange of ideas, making sure that people respect each other, and that there's not a confusion about relationship based on the fact that you're free to practically do anything on campus. That's my job. Protect the borders here. But it was going on, and that's all I can say.
There's this book that you might have seen in bookstores. It's called Porn for Women. Have you seen this? And the book's filled with men like doing the dishes. And every time I see it, I want to burn it, right? There was a postdoc in the study of women in gender society 2 years ago, Christine Labuski, who wrote a really excellent piece. Yeah, you love her, wrote a really excellent piece on the aesthetics of pleasure in pornography and sort of how the female orgasm is portrayed, or usually times not. And I think that's really another important thing to think about, is women is the generator of desire and pleasure as opposed to always being the object of desire and pleasure. So yeah, if you partake in any sort of graphic viewing, just be cognizant of the sort of like aesthetic structures that are put in place to kind of minimize female pleasure and desire. On a practical level, so what ways can men get involved in the community, within Rice, in their day-to-day lives, to be involved in gender equality, in feminist movements, and any sort of activism or advocacy?
Well, I'm going to give props to that for volunteering and being there. So,
Yeah.
volunteering.
And if any of you are interested, come talk to me afterwards. There's more volunteers.
Yeah, you can always chill out. It's find a place to work. If no one shows up, then oftentimes people will come by and you can just relax and just keep on working. I'm there.
I would say that you can't do enough, whether here or anywhere, to promote female leadership.
My actual answer to the question would be to go out and vote, send letters, show your support, things we talked about earlier. Be cognizant of things that people are saying and doing around you, and if you find something intolerable and you think it's appropriate, call it out.
I guess the only thing I would add would be, as he said, vote, because I'm still struck by Virginia and this whole trans. Yeah, if you haven't heard about that, definitely look it up. But the fact that there was no woman present to speak really shows that then it had to fall onto a man to be in the room to speak for them.
Oh, you're talking about the DC hearings now?
Yeah. So my whole thing is that in those type of instances, that's when your voice is really, really important. As a man who does see these injustices, is for you to then bring it up if you do not see a female in that position speaking up. And then when you do get into those positions where you do have authority, remember conversations like this. Remember your own personal viewpoints. And if you see those things that are in policies, that are in procedures that are going to be anti-anybody, use your voice and use your position to go against that.
For those of you who were unaware, there was a federal hearing in DC about the issues surrounding birth control. And on their panel of experts, there were a total of 0 women talking about birth control. And birth control obviously benefits everyone, but women use it. So that was pretty, enraging. And there was the Georgetown law student who was going to speak, but unfortunately didn't speak, but was still called a slut anyways by Rush Limbaugh on the same issue.
Well, because she spoke for the Democrats separately.
Separately.
And they refused to let it be filmed or broadcast.
I would just add to that involvement piece, sort of look around your immediate areas, undergraduate student in philosophy. What can I do in my department to contribute? And that helps me because there's so many things there's so many emails to sign, but if I can look sort of more local, very, very local, and then I can really feel a part of it. And so one thing that occurs to me now is related to LGBT issues is that we have no professor in our department that's gone through the Rise Out. So there's another thing besides helping with this conference and those kind of things.
That's fantastic. sexualized events, and while I think that in and of itself is not necessarily a bad thing, sometimes there's a fine line between a sexy event and a misogynistic event or misogynistic publicity for certain events on campus. So please feel free to voice that opinion through your college structures or just within the greater community of race, because there's obviously people here to listen to you. So do any of you have questions for our panelists? Go ahead.
Okay, so how do you think that the power dynamics have changed with women entering the workforce over the past several decades? And how do you think that that change in power dynamic with women gaining more power by having more of an economic responsibility to family has either promoted or oppressed feministic ideas?
Have you seen the film Misrepresentation?
No.
Please watch that film. We are very lucky that the Wellness Center here owns a copy, and there's every intention of staging another screening. Was anyone in here at that screening? Yes. Okay, great. More people need to see it because it's talking about what happens precisely to women who do rise to positions of power and how they still are read, right? People commenting on Hillary's hair rather than her foreign policy perspectives and her achievements. Primarily, in the title of the news article, hair looked bad. Hillary goes to Iran. So that, I think, is a stark reminder that however much there is change, some perspectives are slow to shift. So.
But in general, I think it's been good.
I mean, it's happened in some areas, but then there are other areas where there's still disparity. Philosophy is one of the disciplines, or other disciplines where there's disparity. So,
Yeah, I think the most difficult part, and there are many difficult parts, but if you decide to have children and you're a woman and you're very capable and educated and ambitious, you have to do it all. And doing it all is really not, so I mean, lots of women do it, they do it all, but it comes at a great cost somewhere. And so again, it goes back to economics and what our society is willing to pay for to have a certain standard of living. So if you're in Sweden, I think it's Sweden, right? They have the most advanced form of child care and time off for men and women now after a child's birth or illness. That looks to me like a quote-unquote advanced society. We're not that advanced, so I think that we have a lot of work to move to that place. And what would it look like? Well, let's get there first.
I also think it's important, I'll just add, to be cognizant of the ways in which economics and statistics are employed to talk about progress in the female sphere, because, for example, you had this rhetoric about how the recession was hitting women more strongly than men. It's called the man session. But if you looked at the types of jobs that were being let go, these were like low-wage jobs that women had. I think it's important to kind of just not take employment as the be-all, end-all. So a woman's employed, that's great, but what kind of job does she have? What kind of benefits does she have? What opportunities does she have to advance in society? So just really be cognizant of the sort of statistics and economics that are being employed in media. More questions?
So my favorite pop icon, RuPaul, once said, every time I bat an eyelash, it's a political act. And I want to emphasize that the politics, that the political is in everyday life. And I want to ask the panelists if they can give advice for people who aren't involved in gender studies like I am to notice the political in everyday life as it has to do with issues of women and gender.
The most important thing for me was to be informed. You don't want to find out about a policy you disagree with after it's already been enacted. And so I, out of curiosity and not any sense of duty, and so I encourage you all to be curious as well, but read up on what the state is passing, what the federal government is thinking about passing, what bills are passed, just what's in the news. So you aren't caught by surprise if there's some law passed that you don't like. So you can write your congressman. You can't get involved about things you don't understand.
I encourage everybody to talk about what sexism looks like in your local space, in your suite, in your college, in your government, your department. Sexism and acts of sexism are everywhere and daily. So it's a daily opportunity just to notice, oops, there goes one there again. And the funny thing about all the isms is that you got the internalized part. So lots of women may be unaware of sexism because they've internalized sexism. Just like a lot of people of color have internalized racism, so they sort of slough off actual racism directed at them. This happens all the time with all the isms. So conversation.
Kind of similar to what Rue does. Don't correct yourself, in a sense, in that allow yourself to be who you are and kind of notice when you self-correct yourself because you feel like that's not in line with what society has dictated is assigned to your position. So I tell this a lot to LGBT men when they try to catch themselves because they're not acting to what they consider to be girly, or they're doing something that's not quote unquote masculine enough. I'm like, well, why? It's who you are. You put the definition of who you are on your own self instead of having to self-describe to all that. And trust me, once you do that, you free up yourself first off internally, but then also from a political standpoint, you redefine for people what it is to be a man, because you were still a man, but you're still just in who you are.
Question, Jenny? I was curious, in your personal lives, what kind of reactions have you gotten for being a male feminist? I wonder if there's been any kind of stigma, like positive things. Like I don't know. How is it? What's it like?
I get paid for it. So there's one of them positive development.
And my question to my dad is, how are you going to get paid for it? Especially when I decided to get a master's in sociology. It was like, what are you going to do with this? I get very, to be a black man who talks about feminism, I get looked at very weirdly sometimes. Because it's just like, why?
Like people have this attitude on their faces, like, don't you have something better to do? Is that?
Almost. I got that. I definitely got that. It's like, don't you have anything else better to do with your time? And I'm like,
Maybe
no, I don't, because my oppression is the oppression of all people. You're being oppressed the same way, so I'm trying to get you to understand, let's stop oppressing if this world will be better. And then, guess what? You'll have more free time to do other things.
I have the advantage of still being a student at a great university, and so I can't say I've really run into particular hostility.
I've had some positive things being in this rigorous program, and so I'll have colleagues. I'm trying to think if I've had any professors come and ask me, here's something about feminism, or a couple of them are going on the job market now, and a few universities want to teach feminism, and they'll have a read on the literature, and so they'll come and ask me, and that's been really good. But then there's been pushback. I remember when I was standing. This isn't at Rice. This was at another school. But people were talking about some of the theories in feminism, and one of them was that, do you know what they call one of their theories? Eurocentrism, with this look of disgust and humor. So I've encountered some of that. Coming to this panel and getting, it's sort of it's a sort of, in my personal life, I realized that I sort of let some of these things slide, and that not identifying as a feminist as often, and so it's kind of this has been like a reawakening or resurgence, but what I'm trying to say is that sort of, you gotta keep your garden going. It's a kind of ongoing personal project.
We've had some really active male volunteers and coordinators within the Women's Resource Center, and one of them in particular was kind of receding one year. He was stepping back, he wasn't coming to events anymore, and I kind of talked to him. I was like, what's going on? And he was like, well, my friends, they're saying, well, you're just doing this to get with the girls, and you just want to up kind of bowing out. But I think maybe you should all be cognizant of the ways in which men are indicted for standing up for women. Or there's always this like a questionable motive going on. And I'll also plug that if you want to be a coordinator in the Women's Resource Center, our applications are due on Sunday. So that's talk to us. Any more questions?
Last week I had the opportunity to volunteer at a women's shelter through Alternative Spring Break. And these were victims of domestic violence. A lot of the women we worked with actually consider themselves second-class citizens and actually thought that they deserved the treatment that they were getting from this man. So as far as the feminist movement is concerned, what are we doing to make sure that not only men are seen as equal, but women themselves are seen themselves as equal members of society?
It's a really difficult question, especially when you ask the rest of it, equal to whom, right? And this is, I hate to run back to Bell Hooks all the time, but she's so cool. She really got a lot of this back in like the 80s. It's all written down here. So go to Feminist Theory from Margin Center. If you haven't read it, please read it, by all means. But one of the questions she asked is, if women ask for equality, to whom are they asking to be equal? Are they asking to be equal to people who get minimum wage jobs that they can then lose the next week because the owner's son needs a summer job? That's not equal to anything I would want to be equal to. And so part of what you're dealing with there is to whom they'll see themselves as comparable, right? And I hope that these women's centers, the ones that you're visiting, are concentrating on finding ways that these women's voices can be audible to themselves first. And I think that's where it starts. I really do. Because if you don't think that your own voice is worth hearing, who else is going to listen to you? So I think that's part of it.
I don't have a great answer to such a difficult question. The only thing I can see that I can do as a man is to be involved and be just one part of a chorus of people that says there are many people who don't approve of what's happening to you. It's a difficult line between respecting someone and also being willing to tell them they're wrong. I think you can't. You have to respect a woman's autonomy to an extraordinary degree. You can't be a feminist and not give that respect. But I think you also reserve the right to say, I think you're making a mistake. You're not holding yourself to the best standard possible. And this is really difficult because, especially in domestic violence, which I've done my best to read about. It's a huge problem where women think they deserve it, where they get trapped, and you absolutely can't take a stance where you blame them for making that choice. The worst thing I've ever heard is for people to say, "Oh, well, why didn't you just leave?" They may have never been around men who respect them before. They may have come from families and their friends of their family treated women this way. They may not have a great education. They may have no contacts. They may have been they're often isolated by their abusers. They're in the wrong city. They don't know anybody. So a long list of things. And so all you can do is say that is support places like women's shelters. You can say not only do you deserve better, but I don't blame you for the way you've been treated, and we're going to try and help you get out of it. And so just join the chorus, I guess.
So Norma, I think that whether it's domestic violence or racism or sexism or if you get hit hard enough for any kind of oppression, you get discouraged. And so there's a moment where people are looking for help, but they're so discouraged. They don't know what's in front of them. And so advocacy on behalf of people who have been really hurt, wounded, ultimately takes the form of always being there to encourage them to take their own next step, whatever their own next step is. So encouragement can come in many different ways, to financial assistance, physical presence, but I think figuring out how to encourage the person in front of you is probably the most difficult thing, but also perhaps the key to unlocking that person's next forward step.
We'll take one more question because we're a little bit over time. Go for it.
it was an observation as another older male feminist talking about some things José said. There's been a lot recently about sort of the general idea of the mommy wars, whether it's the tiger mom or bringing up baby and all those sorts of things. And I would just observe it's very corrosive to have women who've chosen to be in the workforce or stay at home sort of fighting against each other rather than trying to figure out a system that is going to be more humane in general. I would just say in general, if you decide to try to balance parenthood and anything else, make sure you really have an understanding with your partner, male or female, about how that's going to play out, and don't be with anyone who's not going to change diapers. I'll just...
And on that note, if we could thank our panel, amazing.